But as as I was kind of thinking about and right, been here for quite a while. We've been social distancing for at least a solid 2 months. We've been on like an official shelter in place for a month and a half, and we've got another month in front of us, right? Um, and I think most of us have kind of gotten over sort of that fad that was going around about like, let's just like, be your best self during quarantine, pick up 7 new habits, new hobbies, and things like that. I was definitely trying to do that. We had that sort of adrenaline of just like all the new things that were happening and our routines being thrown out of balance. But here we are, and I think number of weeks into it, I don't think we're there anymore. I don't think we have that same energy, that same sort of ability to keep kind of that attitude going. And I think we're just finding our endurance is being tested. Our patience is beginning to wear thin. Maybe tensions are a little bit higher with the person that you live with all the time because you see them all the time. But as I was kind of thinking about this season and what it looks like and what it is, I was reminded of a natural phenomenon that is sort of strange. I actually kind of remember it from elementary school. I don't know how, I learned a lot in elementary school, but this is kind of a random thing to remember from elementary school. But there is this natural phenomenon on the planet Earth that used to heavily impact um, ships, like old time ships. Think of like pirate ships with the sails and the masts and the whole thing. And it was called the doldrums. Now there's like a fancy scientific name for it, but the sailors would call it the doldrums. And it's this place along the equator. We have this like overly complicated graphic that's supposed to show up here on the screen, but it's at this place along the equator where the trade winds actually kind of meet each other in the center there at the equator, and they kind of begin to cancel each other out. And then to complicate things more, because of all the heat that's at the equator, right? The sun's really hot there. It heats the water and makes the air go more upwards rather than horizontal. And so if your ship, right, if you have a big sail ship that's heavy, laden down with people and cargo, and you need wind to go forward, but the wind is going up rather than across, you can get stuck. And so these old ships that were trying to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific used to get stuck in the doldrums, and they would get stuck there for days or for weeks at end with no ability to replenish their supplies, no ability to get out and push their boat across the ocean. They were stuck, and they were waiting for a fresh breeze to come and move them forward. And I think we can resonate with that. I think we find ourselves in our own situation where we are in sort of a doldrum situation right now, where we're limited. We don't have the ability to do anything to move the ship of our life, the ship of society forward. We're kind of at the mercy of the winds, at the mercy of the coronavirus and how it is spreading and doing. And I think we have, we can look forward and we can see that potentially we have a long ramp in front of us of things eventually getting back to normal, but it is still going to be a process. And so as we're looking at this sermon series, right, by faith, we're looking at Hebrews chapter 11 and 12. Chapter 11 is that passage, is that chapter where we see the history, the timeline of the faithful people of God who follow after God. And then chapter 12 invites us to take our spot in that line of faith. And so we're just encouraging that. We're focusing in on what does it look like to live by faith, to follow God regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the outcome, to know that God is God and that he has called us to follow him faithfully. But how do we do that if we're in a season of waiting, if we're in a season of doldrums, if we're in a season where we feel like we're powerless to move forward, nothing is moving forward? How do we follow God in that kind of season? And so I want to look at that question today. And I think our next example of faith is a great example of that. In chapter 11, by faith, those words are said 19 times, right? And that each time it introduces an example, introduces a follower who lived by faith. And so I want to just open up by reading the first two verses of chapter 11, just to kind of set that tone, that's opening chapter and definition of faith. And so 11, chapter 1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation." Right? We have that definition of faith up front, right? It's the assurance of things hoped for, right? Hope. I was reading in a commentary and there was a quote that said that hope is faith looking forward, right? Seeing those things that are true but are just out of eyesight and living in light of those. That's true faith, living by faith. And then let's look back now forward, and we're going to look at verse 6 in chapter 11 and look at this example that's given to us in these verses. Verse 6 reads, "And without faith it is impossible to please him," meaning God. "For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." Verse 7, "By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world, and he became the heir of the righteousness that comes by faith." So right there we have this example of Noah, right? Who acted on something that he didn't see yet, something that God had told him was going to happen, but he couldn't see it yet. And I think the definition of faith that I want to kind of give today, or one way I want to look at by living by faith is changing how we live right now because of an unseen reality, because of a reality we don't see yet. I'm going to say that again. Living by faith is changing how we live right now because of a reality, because of a truth that we don't see yet. It's still yet to come. It's still just out of our vision, whether it's in the future or whether it is just out of our perspective in the moment. And we see that with Noah here, right? He was told that there is a reality, there is a flood coming, and he needs to build an ark. And thank goodness that Noah was not like me, was not like most college students, and he wasn't a procrastinator, because he had to trust, he had to live in light of that reality that was coming. He didn't have Doppler radar, he didn't have the Weather Channel, he didn't have even the Farmer's Almanac. He just knew that God had told him that there was going to be more rain than they had ever seen before, and that he needed to build an ark. And if Noah had procrastinated like I procrastinated on most of my college papers, he would not have built that ark, right? Because I know that there's a deadline coming for that project, whatever it is, but I put it off, right? I might say, yeah, I have all the intentions to do it, but I just won't do it. But Noah lived in light of that reality. He actually did change the way that he lived. He actually was obedient to what God had commanded him to do. And so there's that picture of faith. But I think it's more just than that. Like if we think about, because we don't have a flood coming, but it does impact, faith does impact the way that we live now. If we think about food, because I love to talk about food, my favorite course of any meal is always the dessert. Okay? And if you are eating a meal and you know that there's a good dessert coming, you eat differently than if you're not planning to eat that dessert. right? If think about, being at a Thanksgiving meal and you eat too much and you didn't save enough room for a slice of pie at the end. Like, that's awful, first off. But if you are planning to enjoy that sweet slice of pie at the end of your meal, you're going to eat each course of that meal differently. You're going to not eat like this is all that there's going to be. You're going to be eating in light of a future reality, of that future slice of pie that you can't see yet. And that's just the same thing for us. When we live now, right, we change the way we live now in light of a reality we don't see yet, in light of something that we know is coming. It allows us to come to the banquet of the world and realize that we don't have to fight to get everything we want here. We don't have to worry if we're not getting maybe as much as we think we should out of life. Because we know that there is something sweeter, there is something so much greater coming at the great banquet of the Lamb. That there is something that God has for us, that there is a meal prepped in the house of God that will satisfy us deeper than anything we could ever eat or enjoy or possess in this life. And if that reality is clear in our mind, if we act in faith upon that truth, it changes the way we interact with this world. We're able to be generous. We're able to not hold on and cling to things like our lives depend on them. We're able to not worry or fret over small things, over our life of lacking in moments. We're able to truly practice what Jesus commands us to do, to look at the lilies of the field, to know that God will provide and care for us as he does for the world around us. And so that's living now by faith. We do that by keeping in mind a reality that we don't see yet. But I think there's a little bit more to it, right? Because, like I said, as a student, I had in mind those deadlines. I had no doubt that the deadline would come. But I definitely waited until that deadline, until the grade I was going to receive on that paper was more than just an unseen reality to get it done. And so what is it that Noah has faith in? Because Noah didn't just make the Hall of Faith just because he believed that it was going to rain a lot. He had faith in something bigger, right? He had faith more than just this one thing. He had faith in a person. He had faith in God, right? A faith that we can live by is rooted in the character of God, right? What is the substance of that faith? A true faith that we can act on, that we can hold on to, that we can live by each day is rooted not just in an idea, not just in a future promise, but in the person and character of God. That's what roots us. That's what empowers us to live by faith. I want to take a minute and I kind of want to look at that from the context of Genesis. I want to kind of show that a little bit. Because, well, before I do that real quick, I do want to kind of just point out, like, think about the difference between a coach and a teammate, right? If you've got a coach, right? A coach is there during practice, a coach there to root you on, and they'll be at the finish line of the race. They'll be there waiting for you. But what do you need during the middle of the race? When you can't see the finish line yet, when your legs are tired, when you are weary, when you don't want to go on anymore, and you can't see your coach, he's at the finish line. You need a teammate. You need someone who is running alongside you. You need someone who's going to come alongside you and run with you until the end of the finish line. And we have a God who's not just at the finish line, but we have a God who is alongside of us, who is with us, that has a character of faithfulness that we can trust on, that we can be in the middle of this with. And so I want to look at what does that look like for Noah specifically in the book of Genesis. And so turning all the way back in our Bible to Genesis chapter 7. And we're going to look at the story of Noah, and we're going to jump right into the climax, right into the most dire point of this story. The flood has come. Noah and his family are on the ark, and this is the description we get in verse 20 of chapter 7. It says that the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, and all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land in whose nostril was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. Right? All of those details right there are meant to convey to us that things are bad. Things are bleak. The waters have risen. The flood has come. The flood that God said would come has come, and it has destroyed. And Noah and his family are a toss afloat in a boat with nothing they can do about it. They are at the mercy of their circumstances and at the mercy of God. There's no power that he's got there to change things. But it's not just a present, it's not just a future reality. Because if that was where the passage ends, that would be awful. Noah just left alone to deal with the circumstances. God warned him about the flood and told him to get on a boat, but didn't do anything with him after that. Just let him toss and float across the ocean. But no, the next verse says something crucially important. In chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided." Those words at the beginning of that verse, but God remembered Noah. That's so important, that God, his character of faithfulness, he remembered Noah. He, like we were talking about, like Brendan was talking about, when we remember the faithfulness of God and God's continual faithfulness. God has never failed before, and he won't fail now. See, Noah, when he was building the ark, when he was going through this, he didn't just have his eye on the flood that God was going to send. He didn't just have faith that God was going to send a flood. He had faith that God was going to get him through that flood. Right? The faith that we can live by is rooted in the character of God. It's rooted in who God is, in his steadfast love, in his faithfulness to us. We have a God who has given us all things, who has given us his Son. We have a God who has become man, who lived, suffered, and died alongside of us in order to give us life. What else is there that God could potentially give us? He has given us himself. And so when we have that truth in mind, what kind of perspective shift does that give for us as we are waiting in doldrums, as we're waiting in seasons of transition, as we're worrying and fretting about the flood and the waters that are rising around us? We can remember, we can call to mind the reality of God's faithfulness, and that he will remember us, that he will not forget us and leave us to our circumstances, that this is not the final chapter in the story. No matter how bad, no matter how bleak it gets, God is doing something in the midst of this. God purified and cleansed and the world and brought Noah through it. There's always a preservation. When we read that verse earlier in 1 Peter, where we talked about faith being trialed by fire, right? Faith being purified by fire. When floods come, when situations like this come, that the impurities of faith, the things that maybe we hold on to that are not God, that we're putting above God, are washed away or purified away by the trials that we're experiencing, leaving us with a clearer and purer faith in the character of God, knowing that God is getting us through this season just like he got us through the last one. I want to read this quote to you that I think just summarizes this in a beautiful way. This is by John Calvin, a theologian. He says, "Our hope is in no other save in thee. Our faith is built up by thy promise free. Lord, give us peace and make us calm and sure, that in thy strength we endure evermore." Wow, just like that idea. Lord, give us peace, make us calm and sure, being rooted in the promise and the faithfulness of God, right? We can live by faith by keeping those realities of God's character and God's promise to get us through it and God's promise to bring us to a banquet where all of these things will be made right. We don't have to be dominated by fear. We don't have to be dominated by worry. We can live by faith, rooted in God's character. And so as we kind of think about that, as we kind of do that, I want us to be able to perhaps say, right, that God has remembered me. That my prayer for you is that you would be able to say, along with Noah, that yes, I'm surrounded by fear, but God has remembered me. Yes, I have lost my job, but God has remembered me. Yes, I am isolated and I don't have any control, but God has remembered me. I have perhaps lost a loved one, but God has remembered me. And I want that to be able to be the soul cry of our hearts today as we look at the faithfulness, the character of God, that he will not abandon us to this circumstance. And I want to leave you with sort of a battle cry for that, sort of a psalm that we can turn to throughout this week. And if you're feeling like you need to claim that a little bit, you need a reminder of God's faithfulness and goodness and his steadfast love for you in Jesus Christ, I want to encourage you to look at this psalm, Psalm 136. This psalm, the whole thing, is just a praise of God and who and what he does and who he is. And I just want to leave you with this last section, this last couple verses here in verse 23 of Psalm 136. Verse 23 reads this: "It is he who remembered us in our low estate, for his steadfast love endures forever, and rescued us from our foes, for his steadfast love endures forever. He who gives food to all flesh, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of heaven, for his steadfast love endures forever." Just let that be a prayer of praise, a prayer of reminder that God has remembered us in our low estate. God has rescued us from our foes, from our circumstances, from COVID-19, that God has rescued us and provided all of our needs. He's provided all food for flesh. And that God's steadfast love endures forever. That's a faith that we can live by because it's rooted in who God is. It's rooted in acknowledging that he is God, that he is far above us, and that he is with us through all of this. And so, with that, I want to invite you to join with me in this final prayer. This is going to be our prayer during this season, a prayer that we hope you can pray, that we can practice and say together as a community to begin to live by faith each day. regardless of the circumstances, regardless of our control, even if we're in seasons of waiting, seasons of doldrums, we're not sure what the future is going to be. We want to live by faith. So if you would join with me in saying this prayer that's on the screen. Father, help me to live by faith and not by fear, panic, or short-sightedness. Help me to live by the assurance of your promise and not by the fragility of income and health. Help me to find my ultimate security in you, the one who died to deliver me from death. Amidst the uncertainty of this season, remind me that you are the sole source of certainty. Teach me, Father, to live by faith and help me to draw near to you. Amen.